Hi everyone, what you're about to listen to is an interview that Tree and Prince did with Justin from the Fine Blueprints podcast, which is part of the Fiction First network operating out of the Blades in the Dark Discord server. In this interview, Tree and Prince talked about our world building for Uduasha. The Fine Blueprints podcast is no longer available online. You can still Google them and find the episode listings, but the episodes themselves are no longer being hosted. We received permission from the creators of the podcast to host this interview ourselves on our feed. We thought it'd be nice to preserve this for sentimental and also archival reasons, and to offer you guys who are listeners of our show but didn't manage to listen to that interview on the Fine Blueprints podcast at the time, a chance to do so now. So without further ado, the audio given to us by kind permission of the Fine Blueprints podcast.
The last rule that we came up with was something like non-humans are not permitted to play.
I'm pretty sure Chloe just introduced that rule because he hates Airbud, but I don't know.
I beg your pardon?
That's just my...
Oh my god! Okay, I should...
I just feel like we specifically have an anti-Airbud rule.
So dogs cannot play roofball.
Yeah.
Officially, there is a rule.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, that's good to know. Okay, I should keep this in mind.
Welcome to Fine Blueprints, an important part of the Fiction First network. Here in our metaphorical studio, we interview tabletop role-playing game designers working in the Forged in the Dark space and beyond. I'm Justin, and I'm going to be your solo host for today's episode, your Duasha. Today, we sit down with the members of the Desperate Attune Actual Play podcast to talk about their experience creating the show, and more specifically, how they've taken the Uduasha setting and made it their own. Let's start with you, Tree.
I'm known as Tree. My wallet name is Saumitri, but I go by Tree online, and I've been part of the Fiction First adjacent network for some time. I think, in the hack forums and so on, I use any pronouns. I'm from South India, and I've been kind of designing in the Forged in the Dark space, I want to say, for about a year, but as everybody knows, actually coming out with the final product is very different to the process of getting there. So I'm still in that process.
I'm Prince from Sweden. I've been in running games for a very, very long time. I've been sort of designing games, but mostly like disposable games. You design them one time, you play them, you go like, that was fun. Maybe we should do this again sometime. And then you never do it again. That's largely what my game design experience looks like, but run a bunch of games and very interesting in what we're doing with this podcast, like adapting and setting and making it your own and playing with setting and culture and concepts like that. So that's me.
And we'll be talking about that a lot over the course of this episode, but returning to just talking about the two of you a little bit more, how did you each get involved with the podcast? What's the story behind that? And have you had any experience with actual play podcasts before?
At least for me, in terms of experience with actual play, I was on the actual play for A Fistful of Darkness with Nichelle and a couple of other people from the Fiction First network. And that was an incredible amount of fun. If you watch those episodes, you can see me move from house to house in the background because I was going very many places. And that was a lot of fun. And I think that was my first experience with it. But Prince and I met on another server run by Hiron, who's been on your show before. And everyone on our podcast is on that server as well. And I think that's kind of where the seeds were sprouted, right?
Yeah, pretty much. For me, this is the first encounter with an actual play. I've not done anything like it before. And it's very educational, learning a lot.
And what about your history with tabletop games in general? Is Blades in the Dark your first experience, or do you have a history that goes back farther than that?
I'm going to let Prince take this one first because his history is much longer.
I have been running games since I was 11. I'm now in my 30s, so I've been doing this a while. But I came to Forged in the Dark relatively recently. And it's the server that Tree mentioned, people running games there. I was one of those people who was forever GM and couldn't really be a player in anything, so I decided that I'll join an online community and get to see the player side of things. And so it's in that we actually started out playing Apocalypse World and then got into Blades in the Dark, and it's sort of that route that's taken me here. Now I think I'm sort of back in the forever GM slot. I run most games. I think the podcast is the only one where I'm actually a player at the moment. But
in fact, in one of the games that he is running, I am playing. So I always find it very interesting to see how we are both in each other's games, but our GMing sensibilities kind of come through very clearly in those two different games. So I think something that I really enjoy is the fact that nearly everyone that I play with has experience running games. So it makes that dynamic a lot more fun. I haven't been playing for nearly as long as Prince. I think I started sort of just before the pandemic hit. I joined the Blades in the Dark server, and then I found, just through the Looking for Games channel, I found a game, and I started with Blades. I fell in love with it. I thought it was an incredible system, and I've just been kind of going from there. So I certainly don't have the kind of experience maybe some people have with a more traditional, Dungeons and Dragons or Cthulhu or, systems like that have been around for a much longer time.
Mm-hmm. And transitioning into talking about your podcast specifically, when were you both first made aware of the Uduasha setting that your game is centered around? What was your first exposure to that?
I think I knew there was a special edition when I bought the book. The place that I was buying it from just happened to mention, Kickstarter backers happened to get a special edition with some extra content in it. And I said, that's very interesting. Can you get it? And they said, well, actually, you can't get that anymore. And then I think I encountered it again because people kind of referenced it. They said, this is out there. And one of our fellow players, Cloud, has very strong views about the special edition and about the Uduasha content. So I've spoken to him quite a lot about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and on my end, I became aware of it because the very first Blades game I was in, one of the other players, I think, had the special edition, I think. And they mentioned things from it. We were playing an Eruvian crew in my first Blade games, just so happened. And someone was like referencing it and pulling like, in the special edition, it says this and that about Uduasha. But other than that, I hadn't really involved it in a game since then. And then this podcast idea came up and I was like, cool, we'll finally have a chance to interact with that again.
And the book is generally like this, but it is interesting as someone who only became aware of the special edition myself later on, how little world building there is about Uduasha in the in the basic book. To then, whenever I finally got my hands on a special edition, just to look at it, I don't currently own one. Opening it up and seeing the entire back of the book is like dedicated to this entirely different setting. It was kind of surprising to me. I think I had come across the additional playbook someone had produced. I think some of your cast members used one or two of those playbooks to go with the setting.
Yeah.
As you became aware of this setting and you were choosing to use it for your game, did you already know initially, whenever the podcast was starting, that you wanted to kind of put a creative hand on the setting, like that you wanted to make it your own and alter the setting to kind of fit within your own narrative?
Yeah, for sure. I think that was one of the big things. So Clau and I had been kind of talking about that for a few months before, and the two of us were in a game in the time that actually we played this game now, when we record. And, we'd been talking about that idea on and off for a while. And when we decided, let's see whether we can get a group together to do an actual play, one of the big things we were very interested in was making the setting our own. And what's been super cool is watching each of us take very different spins on the setting and then making all of that work together. And so you see like something that someone's introduced become like used by someone else in a completely different way. And I wish that like I could give you an example of this, but I hope that Prince will be able to come up with that now, because my mind is blanking on.
Yeah. So like when someone has introduced something and someone else has used it, yeah, I think that's come up a fair amount. The one, like an element of Uduasha I introduced was the district of Pasarhantu, which then you as GM took up, and had a whole like this. You call it a vertical maze of murder and.
Oh, it was market and murder. Yeah.
Vertical maze of market and murder in the introduction, right? And this sort of thing, where when one player poetically spins on it, because I just sort of introduced it as it's a very vertical district and it has a place called Murder Alley, and then you get this sort of poetic spin on it. And I think there's a lot of that, where an idea is sort of thrown out as a rough sketch, and then another player refines it into something beautiful. I think that's part of the charm of doing this kind of world building and design. I will say also, I think, Tree, that we are a pretty globe-trotting crew of players. So we have a lot of inspiration from a lot of different cities to draw on.
I kind of gathered that from looking at your bios.
Yeah. And this is also something that like I actually quite enjoyed in maybe not even the first session, but like in our world building, where one of the things that I like doing is kind of inverting the way that some of this works. You know, you think that the older language is like probably inspired by something South Asian, and the newer language is going to be, you know, European. And I just liked the idea that like the old language of Uduasha was based on Dutch. One of our players, Emma, is herself Dutch. So I said, oh, you know, what is the name for Old Well in Dutch? And then it turns out that it is remarkably close to one of the names for a district that we just come up with like randomly, right? And then that just like dovetailed very nicely. That's the kind of thing that we find very, I think, fun, is making these connections, but also leaving them loose enough that we can like just pick it up and run with it.
I want to ask you more about some of that, but I've realized we've come to the point where we need to talk a little bit more about the premise of your show and the story so far. So, Desperate Attune, this is your actual play podcast set in the Uduasha setting, which in the special edition of the book, inspired by both the Middle East and the Orient, you know, in a very vague, kind of fantastical way.
Yeah.
What is the story of Desperate Attune from the beginning and so far?
So the way that we were talking about Desperate Attune initially was just kind of like the themes that we wanted to explore, which we do, which is partially, you know, like bigger ideas of like colonialism, you know, how a foreign power trying to like exploit a local population might go about that kind of thing. But also something much more personal. I think all of us are very interested in themes of family. We were having a conversation just 2 days ago when I discovered that one of my players had a very normal relationship with, you know, their broader family. And I said, well, how dare you do this? Kindly leave. Because I think we're all interested in the way that these relationships can and can't work. So Desperate Attune is the story of like a group of cultists, but cultist in Blades in the Dark has this implication of you're worshipping some kind of god that's going to come and eat you or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a little eldritch feeling.
Yeah, exactly.
And we are absolutely leaning more into the concept of the crew as a family. Like everyone is related one way or another. And it's fundamentally, it's the story of a family trying to get by, who's a family who's put in charge, not voluntarily, but by the accidents of fate, right? They're put in charge of a temple in the old parts of Uduasha. And it's a temple that's quite meaningful to the local community. It's a temple that has like this whole storied history, and it's a temple that everyone knows about. And so you get these themes of legacy spun in as well. And where we basically start the story, I think you introduced this in a very fun way, Tree. We start the story with just having been set up and having had this, I think we established it's been a month or two of being in charge of the temple. And then someone comes to the crew and asks for help, to, you know, invoke some ancient obligation that the temple has. And that's when this family gets thrust into this whole legacy that no one in the crew really understands. And I think part of what's interesting about the story is seeing where that goes, where that connection between like the old legacy and the family that inhabits the temple today, what comes of that.
Yeah. And I think when you start playing in this kind of campaign where things build on each other, something that happens in the very beginning has very strange effects as it like goes on, right? So a very small detail that I introduced in the first session about, like, I was saying something about the sun doesn't really rise. And then Klaus said, oh, you know what? I know that there is a sun in Uduasha because they have a massive mirror. And this mirror reflects the flame that comes out of the well in the middle of the city. So that's how they simulate sunrise and so on. And so now, every time I'm describing someplace, I'm thinking to myself, there is a massive mirror in the sky, and it is reflecting flame, and that is sunlight. So what does this mean for the average person walking through the street? That's been something that I've really enjoyed, because it's the same thing that, like, when you, or at least for me, when I walk, and I live in India, it's kind of unmistakable to see the effect, not just of like British colonialism, but like the centuries of history that have come before that. And like, it's this kind of thing. Someone built something and it's very present, but you don't even think about it until you look up and you go, oh, there it is. So a lot of that kind of theme was something that is something I'm interested in personally. So now with the latest episode, we've just done our first score. We're into our first, proper downtime. And we're seeing the characters pick up on some of the threads that they want to explore longer term.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Where we are in the story at the moment, I think our biggest challenge in the episode that's coming out, this week, we're focusing on people who want to renovate our temple. And rather than renovate, like replace it. Well, they say renovate, but they mean replace it, modernize it with something else. So we have this kind of modernity versus tradition going on as well. And the characters are solving this by throwing a very chaotic charity event that becomes our score.
So your characters are actively having to deal with some of these issues that have taken a long time in the real world, but are very real. Got it.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
That makes a good segue for me to ask about something I've been wanting to ask for a little bit, which is, Prince, let's start with you. What is your favorite detail of the Uduasha setting as it is, and what is your favorite detail that another player has added to your version of the setting?
It's kind of a tricky one, but I'll answer both of them in one, I think, because none of this has been my idea. Oh, well, it was a little bit my idea, I think. We have this, so we don't have spirit wardens, we don't have these like traditional establishments or institutions that you think of in Duskfall in like, the typical setting. So instead of the spirit wardens, we have this ancient institution called the Chandlers, they make candles. And I think my contribution was just like the guys who make candles should somehow be important. And then in our world building together, I forget who came up with this, but somehow we was introduced this idea of beehive wax golems.
Uh-huh.
There are these golems that walk around and keep like the spiritual safety that are full of bees.
Oh.
And instead of the Death Seeker crows, we have bees that like, eat the dead and take them back to their golem hives. And
that is cool. And a little horrific. As someone who likes horror, that's also kind of scary, but also really cool.
Yeah, we have a lot of these kind of creepy elements in it. And that's something where, like, I think I introduced the whole idea that candle making is like an important spiritual craft, and then someone else added, like, the candle makers make golems. And yeah.
Oh, God. Is corpse honey a thing? Oh, I shouldn't have asked that question.
You know that it definitely is. And we have not, so nobody, minor spoiler, but nobody has, like, murdered anybody on screen yet. And so we have not seen the process of the bees, appearing. But yeah, I mean, corpse honey is absolutely a thing.
All right. And I'll ask you the same question, Symmetry, as the GM. Like, what's something that you appreciate about the setting as it was introduced in the book, and what's something that another player, has introduced to the setting?
So I think what I really like about the base setting is how Uduasha is made very different from Duskwall because of the way the ghost field operates. So we're told very explicitly that, in Duskwall, there's always some kind of like weird electroplasmic horror waiting to appear almost, right? And like to some extent, because we're playing, we don't see all the bits of the ghost field where nothing is happening. We only see the bits of the ghost field where there's like a 6-armed, 4-mouthed thing waiting to jump out at you. But it does make clear in the book that because of the well of flame in Uduasha, the ghost field is actually quite calm, and you can't just like do some attuning and like make something happen. Like it makes a lot of that kind of spooky element very different, and I really appreciated that. And I think somewhat related to that, the thing that I really appreciated about the world building was how we were talking about, okay, there are these demon princes in Uduasha, where do they live? And then I think it was Clow who said, so in the base book, there's 4 demon princes. How about we just make a 5th? And then someone else said, okay, so we've got these 4 big demon spires, but what if there are 5 demon spires and they're like a hand rising up through the ground? But you don't see that unless you're very far away, right? And that was such a cool image of this very vertical city and these 5 demons who, do they exist? Do they not exist? Are they myths? These are all like really cool questions, but at the end of the day, you can see the tower, right? Mm-hmm. So I really enjoyed that.
The element of the ghost field and how it's treated differently from region to region, which I think is introduced pretty well in the book, it is really a fascinating one for people to play with. I know the people who are doing the Dagger Isle supplement are playing with that too a lot. And in a way, one of the cool things that John introduced in the setting is that the ghosts and the ghost field are kind of like weather. They're kind of like the environment stand-in. And different cultures treat the environment of the ghost field differently or have different relationships with that. And that's really cool. Bees, and the possibility of corpse honey and these demon princes, that does sound like a really fun setting to play in.
Yeah, I think what I really enjoyed also is because we've taken, and we should shout out Johnstone Metzger, who wrote those Aruvian playbooks. One of the playbooks in that set is called the Rakshasa, and Rakshasa is kind of like at least in South Asia, it's a word for like, monster or whatever, right? Like, and that is kind of how it's played even in those playbooks. But we decided that we would just make them kind of a holy order. So we have these people who are in charge of kind of guarding the bees and like following them around, like, oh, this is what's happening to the city. Okay, we have to clean up this place because we can see that the bees are congregating there because of a corpse, all this stuff. And that was, again, very interesting because you take something that it looks like a playbook, right? And in the base book, playbooks are treated both as like things that exist in the world and ways for us to think of characters, right? So they'll say, maybe you should hire a whisper. But at the same time, it's like whisper isn't really like a playbook. It's not like every whisper can do these 5 things, right?
Right.
And in the same way, I think some of the things that my players have done in terms of like making those distinctions where you point at someone and say, this is a vizier or this is a Faris or, that kind of thing have been really interesting.
Yeah, I think the space of playing with the playbooks as in fiction, you can get a lot of inspiration, right, from playbooks that are not in use. And this is not an example that appears on the podcast, but in the game that I'm running, that Tree is in, I kind of deliberately threw out the line like, we need a savvy head in a game that isn't Apocalypse World, but in a game where everyone has played Apocalypse World. And you can use the terminology so beautifully like that to convey a lot of setting information when you have that common ground. And you have the common ground because everyone's read the playbooks. So you can say, this is a whisper, and everyone will know roughly what that means. And I think that's a real strength of mechanics that slot very strongly into the setting and the story of their world.
Yeah.
Prince, you're playing a Ferris in the game, which is one of the additional playbooks. Honestly, some of the first original playbooks to be created for Blades in the Dark, because Johnstone Metzger was kind of in tune with the project and what have you. How do both of you feel about those playbooks that were created for Aruvia? Understanding that this was early on in the process of creating original playbooks for the game in general, and how do they compare to the playbooks in the original Blades?
Yeah, so in my first game, we actually played an Eruvian crew. And so I was introduced to these pretty much immediately as I started playing Blades. So to me, they've always felt very much like part of the game, and it feels like Eruvia definitely has always been the most like developed and fleshed out part of the world, other than Duskfall and Akoros. And so it's always felt to me a pretty natural part of it, but it would be interesting to see further development of the other regions. And I've myself tinkered a bit with the project to elaborate a little bit on Skovlan, which maybe we will do a thing with at some point.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting. And so to me, Iruvia has always felt a little bit like where Aladdin is set. It's not immediately clear, like where is Aladdin set? You kind of know, but you kind of don't know, right? And I think the playbooks also reflect that kind of sensibility. And I think that when I first looked at them, initially because I was going in with that kind of mindset, I wasn't very happy with it. But actually now that I've played with them a fair bit, they add a lot of texture and they fill a lot of gaps that I think aren't necessarily present in the main playbooks. And that is something that's like really interesting to see, because it kind of tells you have the base playbooks. Here's like an idea that someone has used to kind of break away from those playbooks. And then by comparing those two, you get a better idea of like how to think about changing the base book to get like an effect that you want, right? And it can be as simple as the Hound has an ability called Survivor. You get an extra stress box and you can subsist on the various poisonous things that live in the Deathlands, right? In a game that I was in, my character lost an arm, so I just changed it to I can use the other one nearly as well as I can use this one, right? And it's still Survivor. I'm still surviving, but you get the mechanical thing, but it's No, sorry, go on.
And one thing I want to make clear, both for us and for the audience, is in the rest of the podcast, we're going to be talking more generally about the creative process of honing the setting to really be your own. And I want to be clear, like, it's okay if we criticize some of the material that exists. I know John himself has been a little critical of his own, of the setting that he created for Uduasha, and has talked about how if he did it again, he might do it a little differently. And I think we could actually even see that in who he chose to do the Dagger Isle supplements and stuff like that. And same with these playbooks by John Stone Mesker. My own opinion on them is I like that in many of them emphasize things that are a little, the Blades playbooks emphasize the crime elements a lot, which is what Blades is about. It's a crime game. And my opinion on the Uduasha ones is they are less about the crime element and more about like the shared community element of being a crew. In a lot of cases, like there's one playbook that I think is basically just a protector of the rest of the crew, and that really comes out. And in that way, I think they're good, but in other ways, some of them play in some stereotypes about the Middle East and what have you, slightly, in ways that maybe could be improved on, is like my own personal opinion about it.
I completely agree. I just think that like it's just important to kind of recognize, nobody's going to be perfect.
Oh, for sure. And I think there's a lot to love in what exists, both in terms of these playbooks and in the original version of the setting, like demon lords, a world not based around the ghost field, like it's completely different from Akaros and what have you. That's really cool. And with its own culture and its own versions of worship and stuff like that. That's really great. But speaking of, critical elements, let's dig into the topic a little bit and talk about what did you look at and is there anything in the original setting you looked at and were immediately like, this, we got to change this?
Yeah, I mean, there were a few things. The first thing that we did is that we decided that it was going to be a lot more specific. And we say, your Duasha. Our Duasha was very like, I live in the south of India. 2 of my players are from Bangladesh. There's a lot of Calcutta and Dhaka, and there's a lot of Hyderabad where I live. And what that means is that the influences are much more specific to our own kind of histories. And that I think gives it a lot more texture, because it means that like you don't have this thing of like, okay, how are we going all the way from, like the Middle East to Indonesia in the same one sweep, right? And that was something that I think we really wanted to change. And I think that because we have this collaborative process, it became much more fun to come up with that. So what ended up happening is that, like, I think Prince assigned each of us 2 districts in the city and said, it's your job, you got to write something up, right? And we just followed the format in the book, which is very good. So you say, here's the description, here are some notable places, some notable people. You give them some ratings for like security and spirituality and so on. And as you go through that process, the districts that come up later will be influenced by the districts that come up earlier, but also we're talking about what we're writing as we go on. So I can say, look, I've written this in this district. So for example, I wrote up the bottom, like there is an undercity beneath Uduasha, much like there is in Duskwall. And I kind of said very clearly in our chat, oh no, this is just invisible cities. I'm just taking this from Italo Calvino. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, right? And as soon as I kind of communicated that sense of unreality and that sense of like, where even are we, immediately became very clear. And then I was able to kind of talk about that experience without necessarily having to worry that it was going to be too specific, because we already agreed that specificity would serve us quite well. And I think this is probably like a problem that maybe a lot of people have, which is how do you make something fun without like worrying about details that you don't want to worry about, right? And I think each of us has like a pet, I wouldn't say a peeve, but like a niche that we're super interested in. Like Clow really gets interested in bureaucracy. I absolutely love like writing up like little stories, like little myths that people tell each other, right? So I think that can be really useful, but I'm going to let Prince talk now because I have been talking for a while.
Yeah, like I agree about the specificity, and I think, we tried to give it a more specific vibe, but it's also, like you said, like the degree of specificity matters. We've each come up with some things, but I think it's important to also leave holes that can be filled in play appropriately, and we sort of see the setting take shape over time. One of the things that that has come up a little bit is food, right? Because I play a character that cooks extremely badly. That's been something that has been developed over time because we did not establish a cuisine for Uduasha at the outset. So I have been trying to like establish, what kind of food is normal through my character cooking it wrong.
Tell me more, because we know a lot about the cuisine of Duskfall.
Yeah, so my character is actually from Duskwall or from Akoros, and so what she does is she cooks horrible fish-based things because that seems to be what they eat in Duskwall, right? A lot of eel, a lot of stuff like that. And so what we have established about Uduasha is they have biryani, and that's something that my character has tackled wrong. I think Chloe had this idea of that Uduasha food is like, they're very delicate tastes. There's a lot of like, you have to balance flavors very carefully, which my character's just steamrolled across. What little we've seen some biryani, some flatbreads. We've also seen, I think, a lot of, correct me if I'm wrong here, Tree, but we've seen characters that like smoke different like delicate flavors as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not that we've nailed down specific recipes for the setting or anything, but this kind of, I take it as an example because it's one of those things that gets established in play, right? We get to see the cuisine of Uduasha largely through my character's culinary crimes and doing it wrong.
I like that a lot. I as a personal anecdote, I identify with that a little bit as, I've never been to India. I've never been to Southeast Asia. And as a Pacific Northwest person here in the United States, a white Pacific Northwest person, some of the best Indian food I've ever had for myself was actually when I went to Iceland, so shockingly, and they had Arctic cod curry.
That sounds incredible.
At this fancy Indian restaurant there. It was actually very good. But yeah, tell me, you were going to say, Sumitri?
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I was going to add on to what Prince said, which is that we should keep in mind that some things are established in play, and it's good to trust ourselves that they will be established in play. We don't need to necessarily plan that out. Some things will happen. Like, we have a whole theme of roof ball in our game that...
Oh, roof ball is in your setting. Okay.
It is... I would argue, Prince, would you agree that this is one of the central tenets of our setting?
Wow.
It has become one of the central tenets. It was introduced and then it took over more and more. One of our scores is actually just a roof ball match, except, of course, it's a very nebulous sport. So it's basically Calvin ball at this point. We're just making up the rules as we go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Roof ball, for the audience, introduced by friends of the show, the Drakes, in their roof ball supplement, and it has spread throughout the Fiction First network. Now it appears in many of our actual plays.
Yeah, it's a bit of a meme, right?
Yeah, but it's a great one, and something that I absolutely recommend to you. I did this when we were playing, and I think the results were incredible, is that I just said I would like each of my players to give me one rule of roof ball. And, the kinds of things, the last rule that we came up with was something like non-humans are not permitted to play, right? Now, that just raises so many interesting questions and possibilities, right? And this is what I mean when I say, when we trust each other, this kind of thing will blossom in the moment, right?
I will say, I'm pretty sure Chloe just introduced that rule because he hates Airbud, but I don't know.
I beg your pardon?
That's just my...
Oh my god! Okay,
I just feel like we specifically have an anti-Airbud rule. Yeah.
So dogs cannot play roof ball. Officially, there is a rule.
Okay. I mean, that's good to know. Okay, I should keep this in mind.
I have no idea, to be clear. But...
Yeah. Demons, ghosts,
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, that's important. That's important in a setting where there could be a hunter with an animal companion.
But yeah, it's another good example of it, yeah, because it's basically Calvin ball, and we never really nailed down exactly how the sport works. But yeah, it's in there. It's part of the setting and the story. It's quite a big part of my character, which is also something that evolved over time. Even with character creation, I think we've taken quite a lot of cues from each other, where I was just like, I'm thinking my character's hobby might be some sort of sport. And then someone was like, roof ball. And now it's in the game.
Yeah. And I think this is something that I would encourage anyone to do, in fact, is kind of like take cues from each other, especially when you're creating your own setting, because you never know what is going to become an incredible idea.
Oh, for sure. I think the reason why I'm playing the character I'm playing is also like a bit of a meme, because in one of our earliest games, I played another PC's ex-wife, and then apparently that was so funny, or that guy found it so funny, that I just got typecast as playing the wife in other games, and so now I'm doing it again on the podcast.
All right, so you're the wife guy.
Yeah. Apparently I am. But this is sort of like building relationships between players, right? Not to be afraid to have other players define your character a little bit, which I think when you're playing a family, when you're playing a close-knit group, you get so much more story from it, but you also have to be open to, my character isn't only mine. You have to be open for input from other players. And I think you see this a lot in role-playing. It's not unique to Blades in the Dark or anything, but people can be a little bit defensive of their own character, right? This is my character, but I think you get so much more cohesion in a group if you let each other play each other up. I think that's the term I've heard for it, where you pitch an idea about someone else's character and they run with it.
Well, Sumitri, tell me if I'm correct, but some things I'm getting from this conversation that's going in various places is one thing that you do is you give people kind of their own area of expertise on the setting and the world that you're building together. You try to tighten in on the specifics to combat some of the generalities that are maybe not so great in the original setting, but also that's a tough tightrope to walk when it comes to a game that specifically plays in generalities to keep things open for people to create more of their own interesting fiction. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good summation. And I would say that, like, I am very lucky to have a group of players that, like, make walking that line much easier than it has any right to be. Because I find that, if I make an error, they're not afraid to tell me, you know what, I think you're wrong. Which I think that is also something that's very important at any table, right? Like, just to be able to say to your GM in a way that's not like confrontational necessarily, I don't think this call makes sense, right?
Yeah. And I think it's especially important in Blades, actually, what with the whole position and effect stuff. You have to, like, sometimes I think a sign of a really good player in Blades is someone who goes like, no, that consequence isn't desperate enough. Hit me harder.
Ooh.
That sort of thing, right? Where
Yes.
you negotiate around it.
Yeah, I agree completely. And also, there has to be some comfort with part of the conversation is a debate, a lighthearted debate. And that is something that people hopefully through play will get used to, but it is important to that element of the game.
Yeah. Yeah, we've been trying out, a few of us from the same group have been trying out Polaris, which is a game entirely built around this sort of negotiation where you have stock phrases like you ask far too much. And it was a very educational game to play in that sense, because that is a game that just like you say, makes the debate part of gameplay just explicit. And I think you can take a lot of lessons from that for Blades in the Dark.
Yeah, I think in that game, like the main conflict resolution, which doesn't come up a lot, but when it does, is just the oldest game from, I think people might be familiar with it from Neil Gaiman's The Sandman series, because it was featured in an episode when Sandman went to hell or whatever. But like, that's what that game's conflict resolution is, if you could even call it that.
Yeah, and I think, it's educational. It's one of those games that, like, if you're interested in game design, I recommend at least trying it out, because you learn a lot about this sort of position effect, the debate side of play, right?
Yeah. I think the other thing I would add to that is that Apocalypse World is really good for understanding the design of Blades. And it is setting agnostic. I mean, you can clearly see that it is a Mad Max game to some extent, right? But it is also being setting agnostic. Looking at Apocalypse World has taught me a lot about how to make Blades work in Uduasha, because you can learn a lot about like which mechanics need to be changed and which mechanics you better not touch them if you want to have the kind of experience you want to have. So I can't recommend that enough either in terms of like game design and learning how to tweak things.
I feel that in a lot of ways, the setting for Blades is just a very extremely extrapolated version of the very generalized setting presented in Apocalypse World, where if, fast forward 1,000 more years and maybe you get the Blade setting. Yeah, is kind of what it is. Yeah, that's interesting to think about. Well, we've talked about a lot of things, so I'm wondering, one of the last things I'm wondering from the two of you is there anything you want to talk about in regards to your process for creating the podcast and the setting that you're using for the podcast that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I think the big thing that I really enjoy is not planning very much. And by this, I don't mean, I turn up and I have no idea what's going on. I have loads of ideas, but I enjoy not holding on to those ideas very strongly, and I enjoy being surprised by my players. And therefore, what I end up doing is when that happens, when in the moments a new detail pops up, I think to myself, okay, I'm going to pay attention to this detail and I will mention it again in the future so that people remember that, like, oh, this is the kind of thing that is happening, right? And I think that can be really useful because it makes my players, I wouldn't say necessarily that my players need to feel involved because they have written the world along with me, but in general, players definitely will remember when you use things that they've given you. And the other thing that happens is that because you do that, you don't have to worry so much about establishing things as you do about riffing off of them. And that is very useful in terms of creating that like experience of a shared world that is different from the base game. It's your own, and you feel like you know things about it that nobody else does.
Yeah. I will say, though, hooking into that specifically because we're doing an actual play, I find something that I find very challenging is that we don't have this established. We don't have this DOSQL to draw upon. So we can't just assume that the listeners know what is what, which I think is both a strength and a weakness in a sense, right? Because it means we have to be conscious of explaining the setting, which I don't think we would be if we were playing in DOSQL. I think we would sort of assume that the listener is familiar with it. But if you want to reach an audience of also people who are not Blades veterans, I think it's good that we have this unique setting and that it forces us to think a little bit about, we kind of have to interject for the listeners. We have to explain this thing. What is this in the setting? What does it mean?
Yeah.
And I think that can be both a strength and a weakness. It's a strength that we have to more actively think about it. But I think it can also be a challenge when we sometimes forget. I don't know if you agree with me, Tree, but that's sort of been my feeling about it.
100%. Oh, no, I forget far too often. I only realize when I'm listening to the session later on, and I think, oh, we didn't introduce that. And to be honest, Clow, again, is very good at keeping us on track. He will make us stop and say, we have not mentioned this faction before, or this facet of the world building is something we need to kind of like lay out. Because otherwise, for us, it feels like old hat, because we've been looking at it for like weeks. But obviously to the listener, it's not. It's in fact completely new. And it reminds us of how cool it is.
Mm-hmm. And that has been a new challenge for me because, well, this is the first time I do any sort of actual play. And this kind of thinking about making things clear for the listener, I think it's not always second nature, especially when you're used to having a very like close-knit group where everyone knows each other. And I think you find the same sort of challenges in a lot of ways with making an actual play. So it's been interesting.
I think that's a very important thing to bring up for anyone who's listening to this, thinking about making their own actual play podcast, or even just like making their own homebrew version of a setting for Blades in the Dark. One way in which that process differs with Forge in the Dark games versus like a Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons has all the setting in the world. You can adjust stuff within that and still have so much that feels familiar. The moment you do that in Blades, which has a very generalized, some specificity in the main book, but is otherwise very generalized, things become completely unfamiliar. You don't know what is true. And that's okay because the game mechanics don't really rely on you knowing, what is true at any given moment. But it's also a challenge, especially if you have an audience like you do.
Yeah, I think there are both strengths and weaknesses in it because if players are familiar with the setting, you can create so much emotional impact by that shared understanding. Like if you say the Spirit Wardens in a Blades game, then that has an emotional oomph that just the same thing doesn't happen if you say the Chandlers, they make candles and they're scary. You sort of have to explain that lead up to it a little bit. Even if they are just as scary, right? The players won't have the same, or the listeners won't have the same instant emotional reaction. And I think this is a give and take in role-playing settings in general. Like you see in a lot of fan games, they derive a lot of their strength from this. All the players will understand. If you play a Star Wars game or whatever, right? People will understand that if a Jedi shows up, that is a big deal, which they won't necessarily in a homebrew setting. And I think that's an interesting give and take just in the game design space in general.
Maybe whenever the Blades television show gets produced and aired, you'll have a little easier time of it, and people will have a little more. but until then, it's right. You can't just put it's not a book, so you can't put a footnote. It's not. I suppose you could use sound production to kind of give people the gist of how they should feel, but other than that, providing context is how you have to familiarize your audience with your setting.
Yeah, it's why we are, and we've gotten requests for this. So in fact, this Sunday, we're going to record a world building episode precisely because this context, which we're kind of introducing bit by bit through our show, is also something we need to kind of expand on more broadly. So we're going to do a full thing about our process and how we're thinking about factions, which of them have appeared, all of the various districts of Uduasha and their inspirations for them and that kind of thing. Precisely because if a listener doesn't want to listen to it, it's fine. But for the person who is interested and wants to know what we're talking about when we say there's this faction called the Vigilant, for example, then it's very good to like have that resource so they can go and do that. And in a homebrew setting, that same thing might be as simple as a Google Doc, or it might be as complicated as, well, I don't need to tell any GM how complicated that kind of document can get because you've already got a dozen of those.
Well, people who are thinking about listening to the Desperate Attune podcast should look forward to that. I know I personally love a good world building session as a fan of podcasts like Friends of the Table and that kind of a thing. So I'll be looking for that so I can catch up on your setting and get the finer points. I want to learn more about those bees. With that said, thank you both for joining us today and for all your insights into Desperate Attune and into the Uduasha setting as you see it. If our listeners want to learn more about you and your games and your podcast, where can they go?
So you can find us at Desperate Attune on Twitter. No comment about how long Twitter's going to exist. We are Desperate Attune on all of the, wherever you get your podcasts. Our Podbean website is desperateattune.podbean.com. And if you want to write us mail, you can write to us at desperateattune@gmail.com. And, we're always happy to receive fan mail. And we are shortly going to have a YouTube channel so that if you want to use YouTube to listen to things, because I know I do, then that'll also be a good way to find that.
And you, Prince?
Yeah, so I have not published anything I've worked on, so probably not at the moment. Like this podcast is the thing I'm doing at the moment in the RPG space, so find me there.
Yeah, but it's going to happen because I have no shame in telling you that Prince has written some really good Skovland playbooks that are really like evocative.
I suppose I can say that, yes, I'm working on a Skovland, some Skovland playbooks and a little bit about one of the Skovland cities, and that will be a thing at some point, but it doesn't exist yet, so I can't really plug it, but I can tease it, so I will.
I look forward to hearing more about that.
The other thing that I do need to shout out, because Clow will beat me if I don't, is I have a game out called Make Another. It is a Forged in the Dark one-page game about murdering gods and potentially toppling their thrones. I've run it a couple of times and it's been great fun. Of course, I'm biased, but you can find me at itch.io. My itch.io is saumitri.itch.io. That's SOUMITHRI. So you can find me there. And you can also find the Duelist playbook that Clow wrote, which is very good, at clowspeaking.itch.io. Again, a very interesting take and really adds something that I think, it's not that Base Blades doesn't do it, right? It's that it is nice to see something doing it. And that is the way we should, I think, approach playbooks.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love it. As someone who also likes to create playbooks that are evocative of the original game, that speaks to me, and I'll be checking that out immediately. Well, thank you both for joining us today. And to our audience, I am Justin Ford of Mothland Games. Goodbye for now. And on behalf of everyone at the Fiction First Network, we hope this episode has inspired some fine blueprints of your very own.